Hello. With the semester over, I've finally gotten a chance to come back to making these videos. So today I'm going to be giving my take on New York's community preference policy. And as usual, I'm really not an expert on the legal interpretations of the Fair Housing Act. So I'm going to replace the clickbaity title with something that's maybe a little bit more accurate, which is just we're going to look at the effects of New York's community preference policy. So to do this, we really need to go a little bit more into the weeds of how this policy actually works. And so that's what the first part of this talk is going to be on, just diving into what are they actually allocating and how are they allocating it. And then kind of the main conclusion that I have is that actually the way the community preference policy is implemented disproportionately affects low-income applicants. And then finally, we'll close by talking a little bit about the reports generated by the plaintiff and by the city's defendant. And kind of relating our findings to what they said. So let's first just clear something up, right? Because I said community preference disproportionately affects low-income applicants, and you might be thinking, wait, aren't all of the applicants low income? And it turns out the answer is no, not really. So part of the way this program works is it's designed to give different units at different levels of affordability, right? And so we can see this graphic created by New York City, depending on sort of your income and how it compares to area median income, there may be units set aside for you. So very low income people might be making 30 to 50% of AMI, but there are actually some units that are marketed towards people making even say 130% of median income. So here's a building that is listed on Housing Connect, we can see 180 units available, but each of these units, they may differ, first of all, in the number of bedrooms they have, but also in their target income, specified as an AMI target. In this one building, we have 2-bedroom units targeted to 40% of AMI. And in that case, if you say a household of 2 people, your income would need to be between $31,000 and $42,000 roughly to be eligible for these units. However, there's also 2-bedroom units in the same building with the same layout targeted towards people making 120% of AMI. And so 2 people that are actually making somewhere between $92,000 and $128,000 could again be eligible for these quote unquote affordable apartments. So this really goes to show that not all apartments are being marketed towards people with truly low incomes. In fact, there have been several studies showing that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the units that are most in demand are the very low income units, while those targeted towards people with more modest incomes are much less competitive. The Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development also created a recent blog post sort of illustrating the mismatch, where they point out that most of the units that are being subsidized through this program are actually targeted towards middle and high income people, even though these people only make up about 2% of New York's rent-burdened households. So let's take another look at a different building. This building we can see has 225 units available. So let's dive in. So here's a list of some of the unit types available in this building. We see studios, 1-bedrooms, 2-bedrooms, and 3-bedroom apartments. And also we see these apartments being marketed towards people at different percentages of the area median income, 30%, 40%, 50%, and so on. And so if you have, for example, a 2-person household who makes $30,000 a year collectively, they actually could be eligible for a studio, 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom at 30% AMI, a studio or 1-bedroom at 40% AMI, or a studio at 50% AMI. Adding to the complexity is the community preference policy, which says that 50% of the units must go to people who live in the community district. On top of that, there are other set aside. So for example, 7% of units are set aside for people with disabilities, 5% are set aside for New York City employees, and so on. So as you can see, this starts to get really complicated really quickly. How does the city, or more precisely, how do developers actually try to comply with all of these policies? Well, what they do is they start by putting applicants in a completely random order. Right? They call this your random lottery number, your log number. Then they try to satisfy the preferences listed on the previous screen. So in other words, they start at the top of the list and they look for applicants who are eligible for disability preference. And they sort of go down the list filling units until 7% of the units have been allocated through this preference. Then they go back to the top of the list and look for applicants who haven't yet been assigned, who are eligible for community preference. And so they keep doing that until a total of 50% of the units are assigned to people with community preference. Then they go back to the top of the list and look for additional municipal employees until at least 5% of the units are filled with these people. Finally, they return to the top of the list and process any remaining applicants until all of the units are filled. So a couple of things to notice. First of all, someone, of course, might be eligible for multiple of these preferences. So I might live in the community district, but also be a municipal employee. In that case, I would actually count against both goals. Second, if a household is eligible for multiple unit types, so for example, the 1-bedroom versus the 2-bedroom, or 30% AMI versus 40% AMI, the applicant actually chooses where to go. Okay, so that's what developers are doing. The question is, what is the consequence of using this algorithm? And it can be very, very complicated to think about this because there's so many moving parts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to instead consider a much simpler scenario that captures the key features of what's going on here. Specifically, I'm going to assume for now that all units have the same number of bedrooms. So for example, we're only allocating 2-bedroom units. Second, I'm going to assume there's only 2 target income ranges. We'll call them sort of low income and middle income. And I'm going to assume that they don't overlap. So any particular applicant is eligible for only one of these 2 categories. Third, I'm going to ignore the disability and municipal employee preferences. And fourth, I'm going to assume that all applicants to a building are actually eligible and will accept the offer. Suppose we have a new building and we have 1,000 applicants to this building. Let's suppose 20% of those applicants come from the community district, 90% are low income. And let's just assume that income and community district residents are independent. So what this means is we end up with the following, right? We have 1,000 applicants here. Of them, 90% or 900 are low income. 20% of those have community preference or belong to the community district. So that's 180 applicants. Meanwhile, 720 are low income, but don't belong to the community. Similarly, there's 100 high income applicants, and of those 20 live in the community and 80 live outside of it. So let's suppose that we have 100 units to allocate, and 50 of those are set aside for low income applicants, while the other 50 are reserved for middle income applicants. In addition, we have the community preference policy in place, which says that at least 50 of the people that we assign to these units have to be from the community. So we can look at what would happen under different potential policies. If we had no community preference and no income targeting, then everyone would be equally likely to be selected. We have 1,000 applicants for 100 spots, so 10% of our applicants would be chosen. And what that means is that most of the people that are chosen are going to be low income and not from the community district, because that's who most of our applicants are. Now, once we add income targeting to this policy, the story changes a bit. In particular, a lot more middle income people are going to be selected all of a sudden, right? Before, only 10% of the people that we selected were of middle income, but now we've reserved 50% of our units for them. So now half of the people that we select will in fact come from the middle income demographic. However, we still don't have any community preference policy in place. And so among the middle income people, 20% will be from the community district, the other 80% will be from outside. So that's looking at the case where we have income targeting, but no community preference. We can also do the opposite. We can suppose what would happen if we had community preference, but no income targeting. Not so surprisingly, we're going to have a lot more community members selected, right? So instead of 20 community members selected, we'll actually have 50. But disproportionately, these people are going to come from low incomes, right? Because 90% of our applicants have low income. Actually, 90 of our 100 units would go to low income applicants. So I would argue that sort of all 3 of these show effects that are perhaps not so surprising, right? When we reserve a lot of units for middle income applicants, we'll get a lot more middle income people housed. When we reserve units for community applicants, we'll get a lot more people from the community that are housed. I think what gets interesting is when we look at the combination of these two policies, income targeting and community preference. And actually, this is the outcome we would expect to see when using the algorithm that New York's developers are currently using. And the thing that I want to highlight is, in comparison to the previous cases where sort of the most common group to get housed were low-income people from outside of the community district, as soon as we combine income targeting and the community preference policy, almost none of these people are actually selected. And so what this really means is that the policy is having the effect of making it very, very difficult for those with low incomes to move outside of their communities. So why is this? Like, why is this happening? Let's just do a side-by-side comparison of two scenarios, both of which we have income targeting, right? So in both cases, we're going to have 50 people with low income selected and 50 people with middle income selected. The only difference is, in the first scenario, we don't have community preference policies in place. In the second scenario, we do. And what I'm claiming is that in the second scenario, community members are actually going to get 90% of the low income seats and only 20% of the middle income seats. Now notice, without the community preference policy, they would get 20% of both types of seats. So really what this is saying is that the community preference policy is having a very large effect among low income applicants, but essentially no effect among middle income applicants. Now, why is this? Well, in essence, the reason is that the city is not reserving 50% of each type of unit, low income and high income, for community members. Instead, it's just a 50% overall. Now, community members, just like everyone else, are mostly low income. So when we start by filling with community members from the top of the list, most of those community members are going to claim low income units. By the time we've actually filled our community quota, right, allocated 50 people from the community, most of our low income units have already been claimed. And this leaves very, very few units left over for anyone who's not from the community. Let's see how this actually plays out in detail. So in this case, our first pass, we're trying to find 50 community members. And we start at the top of our list, which are people with low log numbers or low lottery numbers. Okay. So we're going to take the top 50 community residents. We have a total of 200 community residents on our list. So that means we're going to get about 25% of the way down the list before we've finally satisfied community preference. Now, at this point, we've taken 50 people who live in the community. 90% of those we would expect are going to be low income. In other words, of those 50, 45 are low income. They're going to claim most of the low income units in the building. Now we go back to the top of the list and we fill the remaining spots. Very, very quickly, we will fill those last 5 low income spots, probably completely with people from outside of the community district. But what we see is actually, of the 720 people from outside the community district, only 5 of them, less than 1%, received a unit. Now, at this point, we can continue looking for people to fill the remaining units, but notice that all of the remaining units are for middle income applicants. So we go down the list accepting middle income applicants until actually we get past the 25% mark that we were at before. And at this point, we actually start accepting not just middle income applicants from outside the community, but also any middle income applicants who are from inside the community. And because there are only 100 middle income applicants in total on our list, we have to go basically halfway down the list before we've managed to fill all of these middle income units. So this results in the numbers shown in this table, where basically if you're a middle income applicant, you have a 50% chance of getting in, regardless of whether you live in the community or not. But if you're a low income applicant, you have about a 25% chance if you live in the community, but a less than 1% chance if you don't. So this was a stylized example with made up numbers. We can ask, is this actually happening? And one important thing to notice is that the same idea that the community preference policy will disproportionately affect low income units is going to hold as long as fewer than half of applicants qualify for community preference and as long as the competition is fiercest for low-income units. In fact, this is actually mentioned in Beveridge's analysis. So here's some of the relevant quotes. I won't read them all to you, but what he points out is that many unit types are no longer available by the time the policy starts accepting people from outside of the community. And he highlights specifically that most of these units, 89% of them, were at low income levels, 60% or below of the area median income. Right? So here are some numbers that he presents. Right? These are all different units where the units entirely went to people from the community and none of them were made available to people from outside the community. And while there's a few exceptions, the vast majority of the cases where this happened were among people with low incomes. I think this finding also helps to explain the confusing conclusions that I talked about in my previous video, where Siskin concluded that actually over 1/3 of all applicants were considered, meaning sort of processed by the developers, but that only 1% of considered applicants were eventually housed. And this seems surprising. I mean, I know that not all applicants are eligible or are even interested in the apartment because some people are just applying everywhere they can without really thinking about it. But I definitely don't believe that 1/3 of all applicants are given a serious consideration to be housed. And I think this ties back to his methodology for determining who's considered. He assumes that anyone who has a better lottery number than someone who got a unit had been considered. So if we go back to our example, notice that the lowest lottery number that we considered was basically halfway down the list. And that's because that's how far we had to go to find 50 middle income applicants. Most of the applicants with lottery numbers better than 50% are low income applicants. And most of them never had a real shot at an apartment because those apartments were filled before they were reached. So even though we offered a unit to person number 500 on our list, actually only 100 of the 500 people above that position were given an offer. Siskin's methodology would assume that all 500 received an offer. Now, he does give a caveat that he adjusts for unit size, right? So if we allocated, for example, a 3-bedroom to someone very far down on the list, but all of the 1-bedrooms were allocated much more quickly, then someone who was in between those two thresholds, but only eligible for a 1-bedroom unit, wouldn't necessarily be treated as considered in his analysis. But he doesn't make any reference to income. In other words, if we allocated all of the low-income units before you were processed and then moved past you because we were looking for someone of middle income, his analysis presumably would still treat you as considered. Here are the relevant quotes where he basically explains this exact idea. In summary, what are the effects of the community preference policy? I would say, looking at the analysis in the plaintiffs and the defendants, they're not so much disagreeing about math. Instead, what they're disagreeing about are definitions, right? How do we even measure or interpret a disparate impact on race? I think a second important thing to note, which is what I highlighted in this video, is that the current policy has unintended consequences, right? So we say, okay, we're reserving 50% of units for community residents, but actually the likely effect is that we're reserving much more than 50% among the low income units, but potentially much less among higher income units. Even though we had 200 pages of reports and analysis on this, and even though Beveridge, to his credit, did sort of start to identify this, it wasn't very clearly stated. And I think that highlights the value of simplifying the setting to one that we can actually think about and understand. So that's all I have for today. Coming up, hopefully in a future bonus video, we're going to look at other ways that community preference could be implemented. So basically, one question we have is this effect that most of the low-income units specifically are set aside for community residents, is that an inherent consequence of the preference policy, or is that really just a feature of the particular algorithm that is currently being used? And I'm going to argue that, at least in large part, it is due to the algorithm and not the policy. So be sure to tune in for that follow-up video. You can check out more of my work on allocating public resources by going to my website, nickarnasti.com.